In the dusty town of Redemption Creek, justice isn't always blind, and the truth doesn't always set you free. When Sarah Calloway finds herself accused of a crime that shook the town to its core, every door slams shut in her face. Her neighbors turn away, the sheriff refuses to listen. Even the church offers no sanctuary. For 3 long weeks, her desperate pleas echo through empty streets, while the town prepares to see her hang. Then one morning a stranger rides in. Maxwell Garrett, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, a man who built his fortune on his word and his reputation on unwavering principle. He dismounts his midnight stallion in the town square and does something nobody expected. He believes her. What dark secret buried in Redemption Creek's past would make an entire town turn against an innocent woman? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Redemption Creek in shades of gold and amber, the kind of light that made everything look like it had been dipped in honey. Sarah Calloway stood at the window of her small cottage on Maple Street, watching the town wake up the way she had done nearly every morning for the past 12 years. Her fingers absently traced the edge of her mother's locket, the worn silver cool against her skin. Inside was a photograph so faded you could barely make out the faces anymore. But Sarah didn't need to see them clearly. She knew every line, every shadow by heart. The cottage had been her parents' before the fever took them both in the winter of... Sarah had been 16 then, old enough to keep the house but young enough to feel the weight of loneliness settle into her bones like cold. The town had rallied around her back then. Mrs. Peterson brought casseroles twice a week for months. Sheriff Brennan made sure her wood was chopped and stacked. Even Mayor Whitmore, not known for his warmth, had seen to it that she kept her father's teaching position at the schoolhouse. Those were different times, better times. Sarah moved away from the window and began preparing for the day. Her schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a whitewashed building with a bell tower that could be heard from every corner of Redemption Creek when she rang it at 8 o'clock sharp. She took pride in that bell, in the routine of it, in the way children came running from all directions when they heard its call. The town itself spread out like a woman's fan along the base of the Montana Mountain. Main Street ran straight through the center, flanked by the general store, the bank, the saloon, and the church. The wealthier families built their homes on the north side where the land sloped gently upward, giving them a view of everything below. The working folk, the farmers and ranch hands, settled south where the land was flat and practical. Sarah belonged to neither world, really. Her father had been educated, a teacher from back east who'd brought books and ideas to the frontier. Her mother had been the daughter of a failed prospector, beautiful and kind, but without the pedigree the northern families valued. Together, they'd created a life that existed somewhere in between, and Sarah had inherited that in-between place. She gathered her teaching materials and stepped out into the cool morning air. The walk to the schoolhouse took 15 minutes, if she didn't dawdle, but Sarah rarely dawdled. Punctuality was a virtue her father had drilled into her, and she honored his memory by upholding it. Along the way, she passed Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch. The older woman gave a curt nod, nothing more. There was a time when she would have stopped to chat, to ask after Sarah's health or comment on the weather. But that time had passed. Sarah kept walking. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and old wood, familiar and comforting. She had 23 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old, children of farmers and shopkeepers and ranch hands. They came with dirty faces and eager minds, and Sarah loved every single one of them. Teaching was more than a profession to her. It was a calling, a way to honor her father's legacy and make a difference in this rough-hewn corner of the world. She arranged the day's lessons on her desk. Arithmetic for the younger ones, history and literature for the older students. She'd been working through the Constitution with the 14-year-olds, helping them understand the principles that bound their nation together: justice, fairness, the right to be heard. The irony of that would come to haunt her soon enough. By the time the children began arriving, Sarah had the classroom ready. Little Emma Patterson was first. As always, her blonde braids bouncing as she ran up the steps. Then came the Morrison boys, twins who could barely sit still for 5 minutes. The Kowalski girl, quiet and serious, already reading at a level far beyond her years. One by one, they filled the room with noise and life and possibility. Sarah rang the bell to start the day, and 23 voices fell silent. She smiled at them, these children who represented the future of Redemption Creek, and began the lesson. She had no way of knowing that in 3 weeks' time, most of their parents would forbid them from speaking her name. The autumn of 1887 had settled over Redemption Creek, with a gentleness that belied the harshness waiting just around the corner. The aspens on the mountainside turned gold, then orange, then a deep crimson that looked like fire against the evergreen. Sarah watched the seasons change from her classroom window between lessons, marking time the way her father had taught her, by the rhythms of nature, rather than the ticking of clocks. Sheriff Tom Brennan was the first person Sarah saw each morning after leaving her cottage. He made his rounds early, checking doors and tipping his hat to the shopkeepers as they opened for business. Tom had been sheriff for nearly 20 years, a steady presence in a town that prided itself on order and respectability. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-handed, but his eyes were kind. Sarah remembered how those eyes had looked at her with genuine sympathy when her parents died, how he'd promised her father on his deathbed that he'd watch over her. That promise had meant something once. Mayor Douglas Whitmore ran Redemption Creek with the efficiency of a man who understood power and how to wield it. He owned the bank, had a stake in the lumber mill, and his family had been among the first to settle the territory. His wife, Margaret, organized the church socials and decided which families were worthy of inclusion in the town's social circle. The Whitmores lived in the largest house on the north side, a 2-story structure with a wraparound roats and imported furniture from San Francisco. Sarah had been inside that house exactly once, when she was 17 and Mrs. Whitmore had needed someone to teach piano to her daughter. The arrangement lasted 3 months before Mrs. Whitmore decided that a young woman without proper family connections was not a suitable influence. Sarah had been disappointed, but not surprised. She understood the invisible lines that divided their town. Reverend Samuel Hayes presided over the church with a fire and brimstone intensity that seemed at odds with his thin frame and soft voice. He was a recent arrival, having come to Redemption Creek only 2 years prior, but he'd quickly established himself as a moral authority. His sermons focused on sin and redemption, on the narrow path to salvation, and the wide road to damnation. Sarah attended services regularly because it was expected, but she often found herself disagreeing silently with his interpretations of Scripture. Her father had taught her that faith should comfort, not frighten, that God's love was larger than human understanding. The Reverend Hayes seemed to preach a different gospel entirely. The town's true power, though, resided not with the mayor or the sheriff or even the reverend, but with the ranching families who controlled the land surrounding Redemption Creek. The Hutchinsons ran cattle on 10,000 acres to the east. The Carmichaels owned the largest horse ranch in the territory. The Bishops raised sheep and wheat on land that stretched as far as the eye could see. And then there was Maxwell Garrett. Even before he arrived in Redemption Creek that fateful morning, his name carried weight. He owned the biggest spread in 3 counties, a ranch called the Double G, that employed over 100 men and shipped cattle as far as Chicago. He built his fortune through a combination of shrewd business sense and unwavering integrity. When Maxwell Garrett gave his word, it was better than any contract drawn up by lawyers. People said he'd come west after the war, a young man with nothing but a horse and a determination to build something lasting. 20 years later, he'd succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. He was wealthy, respected, and known for his fairness in all dealings. Ranch hands would ride 100 miles for the chance to work for him, because he paid well and treated his men with dignity. But Maxwell Garrett rarely came to town. He had no reason to. His ranch was self-sufficient, and he preferred the open range to the confines of civilization. Most people in Redemption Creek had never even seen him, knew him only by reputation, and the stories that traveled through the territory like tumbleweeds on the wind. Sarah certainly had never met him. She'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But Maxwell Garrett existed in a world so far removed from her own that she never imagined their paths would cross. Sarah's life had fallen into a comfortable pattern over the years, the kind of rhythm that brings peace to those who appreciate simplicity. She woke before dawn, prepared her lessons, acted to the schoolhouse, taught her students and returned home to read by lamplight until sleep claimed her. On Sundays she attended church and sometimes took a long walk into the foothills, where wildflowers grew in impossible abundance during the spring and summer months. She had suitors over the years, though not many. Thomas Hendricks, who worked at the general store, had called on her for several months when she was 22. He was kind and steady, and Sarah had almost convinced herself that steady was enough. But when he proposed, she found herself unable to say yes. There was something missing, some spark that her parents had shared that she couldn't quite find with Thomas. He'd married Alice Summers the following year, and they now had 3 children, all of whom Sarah taught. There'd been others, a traveling salesman who stayed in town for a summer, a ranch hand who wrote her poetry that was more earnest than eloquent. But none of them had stirred her heart enough to make her want to abandon the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. At 28, Sarah had made peace with the possibility that she might never marry. It wasn't the life she'd imagined as a girl, but it was a good life nonetheless. She had her students, her books, her small cottage with its garden that produced tomatoes and beans and herbs. She had enough. The schoolhouse itself was her true home in many ways. Her father had taught in that same room, had stood at that same blackboard and opened young minds to the wider world beyond Montana territory. Sarah felt his presence there more strongly than anywhere else, felt the weight of his expectations and the warmth of his approval when a student finally grasped a difficult concept. She kept his books on a shelf in the corner, volumes of Shakespeare and Dickens, a collection of Greek philosophy, works on natural science and mathematics. Some of the older students borrowed them, returned them with careful hands and eager questions. This was what education meant to Sarah, this passing of knowledge from generation to generation, this building of something that would outlast any individual life. The town had grown slowly but steadily since her parents' time. New businesses opened on Main Street. More families settled the surrounding land. The railroad was coming, everyone said, though it hadn't arrived yet. When it did, Redemption Creek would transform from a backwater settlement into a real town with real prospects. Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about that. Change always brought both opportunity and loss, and she'd seen enough of both to be cautious about welcoming too much of either. The children in her classroom represented every stratum of Redemption Creek society. The mayor's youngest son sat beside the blacksmith's daughter. Ranch hands' children learned alongside the offspring of shopkeepers and farmers. In Sarah's schoolhouse, they were all equal, all deserving of the same attention and respect. It was one of the few places in town where class distinctions truly disappeared. She taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and history, but she also taught them to think critically, to question assumptions, to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable. Her father had believed that education's highest purpose was to create citizens capable of independent thought, and Sarah had inherited that belief along with his books and his classroom. Some parents appreciated this approach, others found it troubling. Miss Whitmore had complained more than once that Sarah was putting ideas into children's heads that didn't belong there. The mayor had suggested, politely but firmly, that Sarah should stick to the basics and leave philosophy to those better equipped to handle it. Sarah had smiled and nodded and continued teaching exactly as she always had. She owed her students more than rote memorization and blind obedience. She owed them the tools to build their own understanding of the world. It was this commitment to truth, to questioning, to refusing to accept things simply because authority figures declared them so, that would ultimately seal her fate. But on that golden autumn morning, with her students bent over their slates and the smell of chalk dust hanging in the air, Sarah Calloway had no idea that everything she'd built was about to come crashing down around her. The fire started just after midnight on a Tuesday in late October. By the time anyone noticed, the Whitmore warehouse on the east edge of town was already engulfed in flames that reached toward the sky like angry fingers. The building stored grain and equipment, supplies meant to see the town through the coming winter. The loss would be devastating. Sarah woke to the sound of the church bell ringing in frantic, irregular patterns. Fire. The alarm that brought every able-bodied person running with buckets and blankets and desperate hope. She dressed quickly and joined the stream of people rushing toward the orange glow that lit up the night sky. By the time she arrived, there was little anyone could do except watch it burn and make sure the flames didn't spread to neighboring structures. The men formed bucket brigades from the creek, but the water seemed to evaporate before it even touched the flames. Sheriff Brennan organized teams to wet down the buildings on either side, and somehow, mercifully, the fire stayed contained. It burned for 3 hours. When the sun finally rose, all that remained was a smoking skeleton of blackened timbers and ash. Mayor Whitmore stood in front of the ruins with his face gray and his hands trembling. The warehouse had been uninsured. The loss would cost him thousands of dollars. Money the town couldn't afford to lose. Sarah stood with the other onlookers, her face smudged with soot, her dress reeking of smoke. She felt the same sick horror everyone else felt. Fire was the great terror of frontier towns, the destroyer that could wipe out years of work in a single night. They'd been fortunate it hadn't spread. Then someone found the oil can. It was lying in the grass, about 20 feet from the warehouse, partially hidden beneath a scrub oak. A simple metal can, the kind used for lamp oil, with a piece of cloth stuffed into the spout. Sheriff Brennan held it up for everyone to see, his face grave. "This wasn't an accident," he said, and the words fell like stones into still water. The crowd shifted, people turning to look at one another, with suspicion suddenly replacing sympathy. Who would do such a thing? Who would deliberately destroy property that the whole town depended on? Sarah felt the first flutter of unease in her stomach, though she couldn't have said why. She'd been home asleep when the fire started. She had nothing to do with this, but something in the way people were beginning to whisper, the way eyes were starting to dart around the crowd, made her skin prickle. The sheriff organized a search of the area. Within an hour, they found more evidence. Footprints leading from the warehouse toward the residential section of town. A woman's footprints, small and distinct in the soft earth near the creek. And then, most damning of all, a piece of fabric caught on a fence post along the path. Blue cotton with small white flowers. The same fabric as the dress Sarah had worn to church the previous Sunday. The same fabric as the dress she was wearing at that very moment. Sheriff Brennan approached her slowly, almost reluctantly. The crowd parted to let him through, and Sarah saw something in people's faces that made her blood run cold. Not just suspicion, certainty. They'd already decided she was guilty. "Sarah," the sheriff said, and his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "I need you to come with me." "What? Tom? I don't understand. I was home sleeping. I didn't." "We found evidence," he said, cutting her off. "We need to sort this out at the jail." "Evidence? What evidence?" "That fabric could have come from anyone's dress. Half the women in town have dresses that color." "There's more," Mayor Whitmore said, stepping forward. His face was hard now, the shock replaced by something darker. "My son saw you near the warehouse yesterday evening. Said you were looking at it in a strange way, like you were planning something." Sarah's mind reeled. She had walked past the warehouse yesterday. True enough, she walked past it nearly every day on her way home from the schoolhouse. There was nothing strange about that, and she certainly hadn't been planning anything, unless you counted planning the next day's arithmetic lesson. "I walk that route every day," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your son has seen me walk past that warehouse 100 times. There's nothing unusual about it." "But why were you looking at it?" the mayor pressed. "Why were you stopped there, staring?" Sarah searched her memory. Had she stopped? Yes, now that she thought about it, she had paused for a moment, but only because she'd been thinking about a problem one of her students was having with long division, and she'd needed a moment to work through the solution in her head. She'd stared at the warehouse without really seeing it, lost in thought about numbers and teaching methods. But how could she explain that? How could she make them understand that she'd been thinking about mathematics, not arson? "I was thinking about my lessons," she said. "I wasn't really looking at the warehouse at all. I was just thinking." Someone in the crowd laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Thinking about how to burn it down, more likely." The sheriff held up his hand for silence. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Sarah, I need you to come to the jail so we can talk about this properly. If you didn't do anything wrong, we'll sort it out." But Sarah could see in his eyes that he'd already made up his mind. They all had. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but in a town like Redemption Creek, circumstantial evidence was often enough. People wanted answers, wanted someone to blame, and she was convenient. "Tom, please," she said quietly. "You know me. You've known me since I was a child. You know I would never do something like this." For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Memory, perhaps. The promise he'd made to her father. But then Mayor Whitmore stepped closer, and the moment passed. "The evidence speaks for itself," Whitmore said coldly. "Sheriff, do your duty." Sarah felt the sheriff's hand on her arm, gentle but firm. She could have pulled away, could have run, but what would be the point? Where would she go? This was her home. These were her neighbors, and running would only make her look more guilty. She let him lead her through the crowd toward the jail. People stared as she passed. Some faces showed shock, others showed satisfaction, as if they'd always suspected there was something not quite right about Sarah Calloway. The school teacher who'd never married, who lived alone, who filled children's heads with ideas about questioning authority. Miss Henderson spat on the ground as Sarah walked by. Emma Patterson's mother pulled her daughter close, as if Sarah might contaminate the child just by being near her. The Morrison twins' father shook his head slowly, his face twisted with disgust. The jail was a small stone building behind the sheriff's office. Sarah had never been inside it before. The cell was tiny, barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with a cot, a bucket, and iron bars that seemed to shrink the space even further. Sheriff Brennan unlocked the door with hands that shook slightly. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, and he might have even meant it, "but until we get this sorted out, you need to stay here." "How long?" she asked. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "As long as it takes." The door clanged shut behind her, the sound of the lock turning echoing in the small space. Sarah sat down on the cot and wrapped her arms around herself. Through the barred window she could see the sun climbing higher in the sky. Her students would be arriving at the schoolhouse soon, wondering where their teacher was. She touched the locket at her throat, drawing what comfort she could from its familiar weight. Her mother's face looked back at her from the faded photograph. Forever young, forever untouched by the ugliness of false accusations and mob justice. The first 3 days in jail were the hardest Sarah had ever endured. The stone walls seemed to press in closer with each passing hour, and the silence was broken only by the occasional footsteps of the sheriff making his rounds or the distant sounds of the town going about its business without her. She'd expected someone to come, a friend perhaps, or one of the parents whose children she'd taught, someone who knew her well enough to vouch for her character, to say that Sarah Calloway was incapable of deliberately destroying property and endangering lives. But no one came. On the morning of the 4th day, Sheriff Brennan brought her breakfast. cornmeal mush and weak coffee served on a dented tin plate. He set it on the floor just inside the bars and stepped back, not meeting her eyes. "Tom," Sarah said quietly, "please, you have to know I didn't do this." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. Finally he said, "The evidence says otherwise. The evidence is circumstantial. A piece of fabric that could have come from anywhere. Footprints that could belong to any woman in town. Your own eyes should tell you more than that." "My eyes tell me what the facts tell me," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And the facts say you were near that warehouse, and the fire was deliberately set, and we found evidence that points to you." "What about motive?" Sarah pressed. "Why would I burn down the mayor's warehouse? What possible reason would I have?" The sheriff's face hardened. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Mayor Whitmore seems to think you hold a grudge against his family." "A grudge? For what? For what?" "For dismissing you all those years ago, when you were teaching his daughter piano." Sarah couldn't help it. She laughed. A short, bitter sound. "That was over 10 years ago, Tom. If I was going to seek revenge for such a slight, don't you think I would have done it before now?" "People can nurse grudges for a long time," he said, but even he seemed to recognize how weak the argument was. After he left, Sarah sat on her cot and tried to make sense of what was happening. Someone had burned down that warehouse. Someone had deliberately planted evidence to make it look like she was responsible. But who? And more importantly, why? She thought about the people in town, running through a mental catalogue of anyone who might wish her harm. She'd had disagreements with parents over teaching methods. Certainly, Mrs. Whitmore had never liked her. But to frame her for arson, it seemed impossibly extreme. Unless this wasn't really about her at all. The thought crept in slowly, uncomfortable and insistent. What if she was simply convenient? What if someone needed a scapegoat, and she, with her solitary life and lack of powerful connections, was an easy target? The more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Whoever had actually started the fire had needed to deflect blame quickly. And who better to blame than a woman with no family to defend her, no husband to stand up for her, no social position to protect her? She was powerless, and everyone knew it. On the 5th day, Reverend Hayes came to visit. Sarah heard his footsteps before she saw him, the careful, measured tread of a man who walked through life as if the ground might give way beneath him at any moment. He appeared outside her cell with his thin face set in an expression of sorrowful concern. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice soft and sad, "I've come to offer you spiritual counsel in this dark time." Sarah stood and approached the bars. "Then tell me, Reverend, does your spiritual counsel include believing in my innocence?" He sighed. "I believe in the possibility of redemption for all sinners. If you confess your crime and repent, God's mercy is infinite. I have nothing to confess except the crime of being an easy target." The Reverend's face tightened. "Pride is a sin, Miss Calloway. Perhaps this trial has been sent to humble you, to teach you that we are all subject to God's judgment." "God's judgment I can accept," Sarah said. "It's the judgment of men that seems rather hasty and poorly founded." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not sympathy, but something colder. Satisfaction, perhaps, at seeing a woman who'd questioned his sermons now brought low. "I will pray for your soul," he said finally, and turned to leave. "Don't bother," Sarah called after him. "Pray for the truth instead. Pray that whoever actually committed this crime is brought to justice." But he was already gone, his footsteps fading down the hallway. The days blurred together after that. Sarah marked time by the meals the sheriff brought, by the changing light through the small barred window, by the slow progression of shadows across the stone floor. She slept fitfully, waking often to the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in the silence. On the 8th day, they began building the gallows. Sarah heard the hammering first, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from the direction of the town square. She pulled herself up to the window and peered out. From her limited vantage point, she could see men working with lumber, measuring and sawing and nailing. The structure rose slowly, taking shape over the course of hours. A platform, steps, a crossbeam. Her throat went dry. They were going to hang her. Not might hang her, not possibly hang her, but were actively preparing to end her life. The finality of it hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip the bars to keep from falling. There would be no trial, she realized, no jury, no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to present evidence of her innocence. In the frontier justice of Redemption Creek, the court of public opinion had already convicted her, and the execution would follow as surely as thunder follows lightning. She sank back onto her cot, her whole body trembling. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt the full weight of her helplessness. There was no one coming to save her, no lawyer to argue her case, no friend to vouch for her character, no miracle waiting around the corner. She was going to die for a crime she didn't commit. The thought should have terrified her into paralysis, but instead, something else rose up inside her. Anger, hot and clean and righteous. She would not go quietly. She would not make this easy for them. If they were going to kill an innocent woman, she would make sure every person in this town knew exactly what they were doing. That afternoon, when the sheriff brought her lunch, Sarah stood at the bars and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry beyond the jail. "I am innocent," she said, "and everyone in this town knows it, even if they won't admit it. You're going to murder me because it's easier than finding the truth. Because I have no one to speak for me, no one to demand justice on my behalf. But that doesn't make it right. It makes you cowards." Sheriff Brennan flinched. "Sarah, please, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder for whom? For you? For the people who are going to have to live with my blood on their hands?" She gripped the bars tighter. "I taught your children. I was your neighbor. I never hurt anyone in my entire life. And you're going to hang me anyway. The evidence was planted." Her voice cracked. "Someone burned that warehouse and made sure I would take the blame. And instead of investigating, instead of asking questions, you all just accepted the easiest answer. Because it's convenient. Because I'm convenient." The sheriff looked away. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time Sarah heard the truth in it. He was sorry, but sorry wouldn't save her life. The night after the gallows were completed, Sarah lay awake on her cot and stared at the ceiling. Moonlight filtered through the barred window, painting silver stripes across the stone floor. She thought about her parents, wondered if they could see her now, if they understood what was happening to their daughter. Her father had believed in justice. He'd taught her that truth always prevailed in the end, that good people would always stand up against wrong. But he'd been an idealist, a man who saw the world as it should be rather than as it was. Sarah had learned the harder lesson. Sometimes good people did nothing. Sometimes they looked the other way because it was easier, safer, less complicated. She touched the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar shape of it against her skin. Inside were two people who'd loved her unconditionally, who'd believed she could be anything she wanted to be. They'd given her education, values, a sense of purpose. And now she was going to die in a jail cell, condemned by people too frightened or too lazy to seek the real truth. The unfairness of it burned in her chest. On the 10th day, Mayor Whitmore came to see her. He stood outside the cell with his arms crossed, his face stern and unyielding. Sarah didn't bother to stand. She remained on her cot, watching him with steady eyes. "I suppose you've come to gloat," she said. "I've come to offer you a chance," he replied. "Confess to what you've done, express genuine remorse, and I'll speak to the town council about commuting your sentence to exile. You'll be run out of Redemption Creek, but you'll keep your life." Sarah almost laughed. "Confess to a crime I didn't commit? Exile myself for someone else's arson? No, thank you. Your pride will be the death of you. My pride has nothing to do with it. I won't confess to something I didn't do. I won't lie to save my life." Whitmore's jaw clenched. "Then you're a fool. Do you think dying with your integrity intact will matter when you're 6 feet under? Do you think anyone will remember you stood by the truth?" "I'll remember," Sarah said quietly. "And apparently so will you, or you wouldn't be here trying to get me to confess. You need me to validate your version of events. You need me to make this easy for you." Something flickered in his eyes, anger perhaps, or something closer to guilt. "Though the evidence speaks for itself, then why do you need my confession?" He had no answer for that. After a moment, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. Sarah pulled herself to the window and looked out at the town square. The gallows stood there like a monument to injustice, its fresh lumber pale against the dirt. A few people walked past it, some pausing to look, others hurrying by as if they could escape their complicity through simple avoidance. She wondered who had really burned the warehouse. Someone in this town knew the truth. Someone had struck the match, poured the oil, planted the evidence. They were walking free while she counted down the days to her execution. The thought made her hands shake with rage. That evening she began to shout. Every hour, on the hour, she stood at the bars and proclaimed her innocence to anyone who might hear. The sheriff tried to quiet her at first, but she wouldn't stop. Her voice carried through the jail, out into the street, across the town square. "I am innocent. Someone in this town knows the truth. Someone is letting an innocent woman die." People hurried past, heads down, refusing to look. But she saw the way their shoulders hunched, the way they walked faster as if trying to outrun her words. Good. Let them feel uncomfortable. Let them squirm. Let them lie awake at night wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. She would not go gentle into that dark night. She would rage against it until her last breath. 2 weeks had passed since the fire. 2 weeks since Sarah's world had collapsed. The town had settled into a strange routine, going about its business while a woman sat in jail awaiting execution. The schoolhouse remained closed, the children sent home to help with harvest or assigned to Mrs. Peterson for basic lessons in reading and arithmetic. Sarah's voice had grown hoarse from shouting, but she continued her hourly proclamations of innocence. Some nights, lying on her cot in the darkness, she wondered if she was losing her mind. The isolation, the injustice, the sheer absurdity of it all pressed down on her like a physical weight. She'd stopped eating much. The food tasted like ash in her mouth, and her stomach rejected anything more substantial than weak broth. She could feel herself growing weaker, but some part of her didn't care. What did it matter if she wasted away when they were planning to hang her anyway? On the 15th day, something changed. Sarah heard horses in the street, the sound of hooves on packed dirt, and the jingle of tack. Not unusual in itself, but something about the rhythm caught her attention. This wasn't the plodding pace of farm horses or the quick clip of someone running errands. This was the sound of a horse that had traveled far and was being ridden by someone who knew how to sit a saddle. She pulled herself to the window, gripping the bars for support. Her hands looked thin, she noticed distantly. The bones stood out more prominently than they had 2 weeks ago. In the street below, a man dismounted from a midnight black stallion that gleamed like polished stone in the morning sun. The horse was magnificent, easily 16 hands high, with a presence that made people stop and stare. But it was the man who commanded attention. He was tall, probably 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and the kind of bearing that spoke of confidence earned through experience rather than arrogance. His clothes were fine but practical, quality wool and leather, worn with the ease of someone accustomed to both wealth and hard work. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that suggested he was somewhere in his early 50s, but his movements were those of a much younger man. He tied his horse to the post outside the general store and stood for a moment, surveying the town with eyes that missed nothing. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the intelligence in his gaze, the way he took in every detail and filed it away for future reference. People were gathering already, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable magnetism of the stranger's presence. Sarah heard whispers carrying up from the street. "That's Maxwell Garrett. What's he doing here? Must be important business to bring him to town." Maxwell Garrett. Sarah had heard the name, of course. Everyone in the territory had heard of Maxwell Garrett, the richest rancher in 3 counties, the man who'd built an empire through hard work and unwavering integrity. But what was he doing in Redemption Creek? She watched as Mayor Whitmore hurried across the square, his hand already extended in greeting. The 2 men shook hands, and even from her cell, Sarah could see the way Whitmore straightened his spine, puffed out his chest slightly. He was trying to match Garrett's presence and failing miserably. They spoke for several minutes, their voices too low for Sarah to hear. Then Garrett's eyes moved across the square, taking in the buildings, the people, and finally settling on the gallows. His expression didn't change, but Sarah saw the way his jaw tightened, the slight narrowing of his eye. He said something to Whitmore, a question perhaps, because the mayor gestured toward the jail, toward Sarah. Maxwell Garrett turned and looked directly at her window. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah felt something shift in the air. Recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met, or maybe just acknowledgement. One human being seeing another in distress. Then he nodded, just once, and turned back to the mayor. Sarah stepped away from the window, her heart pounding. She didn't know what that nod meant, couldn't interpret the look in his eyes, but something had passed between them in that moment, something that felt almost like hope. She sank onto her cot and waited. An hour later, she heard footsteps approaching the jail. Not the sheriff's familiar tread, but something different, heavier, more purposeful. The door to the cell block opened, and Maxwell Garrett walked in with Sheriff Brennan trailing behind him like a nervous shadow. Up close, Garrett was even more imposing. He carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd never needed to raise his voice to be heard, who'd earned respect through action rather than demand. His eyes, she saw now, were a clear gray, the color of storm clouds over the mountain. He stopped in front of her cell and studied her for a long moment. Sarah met his gaze without flinching, though every instinct told her to look away. There was something in his examination that felt different from the way others had looked at her over the past 2 weeks. He wasn't seeing a criminal, he was seeing a puzzle, a problem to be solved. "Miss Calloway," he said finally. His voice was deep and measured, each word given its proper weight. "My name is Maxwell Garrett. I know who you are," Sarah replied. "What I don't know is why you're here." A slight smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Direct. I appreciate that. I'm here because I heard about the fire, about your arrest, and about the gallows being built in the town square. And I'm here because something about this whole situation doesn't sit right with me." Sarah's throat tightened. "You're the first person to say that out loud. I doubt I'm the first to think it," Garrett said, glancing at Sheriff Brennan. The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable, but I may be the first with enough distance from the situation to see it clearly. He pulled a wooden chair from against the wall and sat down, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. The sheriff shifted his weight from foot to foot, but didn't leave. "Tell me what happened," Garrett said. "Not the official version, your version." Sarah took a breath and began. She told him about the fire, about waking to the bells, about finding the oil can and the footprints, and the piece of fabric. She told him about her walk past the warehouse, about the mayor's son claiming she'd been staring at it strangely. She told him about the arrest and the lack of trial, the gallows. Garrett listened without interrupting, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he sat in silence for a moment, considering. "You have no idea who might have done this?" he asked. "None. I've thought about it every day, every hour. I can't think of anyone who would hate me enough to frame me for arson." "Maybe it's not about hate," Garrett said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about convenience. You live alone, no family to defend you, no powerful connections to call upon. If someone needed a scapegoat quickly, you'd be an easy choice. It was exactly what Sarah had thought, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone else made it feel more real, more valid. But who would burn down the mayor's warehouse in the first place? She asked. That's what I can't figure out. Who benefits from destroying the town's winter supplies? Garrett's eyes sharpened. That's the right question, isn't it? Who benefits? He stood and turned to the sheriff. I want to see the evidence. The oil can, the fabric, everything you found. Sheriff Brennan hesitated. Mr. Garrett, with all due respect, this is a local matter. And I'm making it my matter, Garrett said, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge of steel. You can show me voluntarily, or I can ride to the territorial capital and bring back a federal marshal to investigate. Your choice. The sheriff's face went pale. That won't be necessary. I'll get the evidence. After the sheriff left to retrieve the evidence, Garrett turned back to Sarah. Tell me about your relationship with the Whitmore family. Sarah considered the question. There isn't much to tell. I taught piano to their daughter for a few months when I was 17. Mrs. Whitmore dismissed me because she felt I wasn't suitable company for her child. That was 11 years ago. And since then, nothing. I see the mayor around town, of course. He's always been cordial enough, if distant. His youngest son is in my class, or was before all this happened. A bright boy, good with numbers. The same son who claimed you were looking at the warehouse strangely. Sarah nodded. Yes, though I can't imagine why he would lie. I've never been anything but kind to him. Garrett paced the small space in front of her cell, his hands clasped behind his back. Children don't usually lie without reason. Either he was coached, or he genuinely misinterpreted what he saw, or he's protecting someone. Protecting someone from what? From being seen near the warehouse before the fire. Garrett stopped pacing and looked at her. If the boy saw someone else there, someone he wasn't supposed to see, he might have been told to shift the blame to you instead. The possibility sent a chill through Sarah. But who would use a child that way? Someone desperate, someone with more to lose than their conscience can bear. Sheriff Brennan returned, carrying a wooden crate. He set it on the floor and stepped back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Garrett knelt and began examining the contents methodically. The oil can was exactly as Sarah remembered it. Dented metal, ordinary in every way except for the cloth stuffed into the spout. Garrett lifted it carefully, sniffing at the opening, running his fingers over the surface. This cloth, he said. What kind of oil leaves this particular stain? The sheriff frowned. Lamp oil, I suppose. You suppose, or you know? Garrett's voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. Did you test it? Compare it to lamp oil from various sources in town? Well, no. It was obvious. Nothing is obvious until it's proven. Garrett set down the oil can and picked up the piece of blue fabric. He held it up to the light, examining it closely. This was found on a fence post. Yes, sir. On the path from the warehouse toward the residential area. Which fence post specifically? The one at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. That's 3 blocks from the warehouse. And you're telling me this small piece of fabric survived 3 blocks of walking, catching on no other fence or branch, only to snag on that particular post? The sheriff had no answer. And these footprints, Garrett continued. How many sets did you find? Just the one. A woman's shoe, small, leading away from the warehouse. Leading away but not toward. Garrett stood, brushing dust from his knees. So, we're to believe that Miss Calloway materialized at the warehouse, set the fire, and then walked home, leaving convenient evidence every step of the way. I don't. That is, the evidence speaks for itself. The evidence speaks for itself, Garrett repeated, his tone dry. Tell me, Sheriff, in your 20 years of law enforcement, have you ever seen a case where the evidence was quite this conveniently arranged? Sheriff Brennan's face flushed. Are you suggesting I did something wrong? I'm suggesting you accepted the easy answer without asking the hard questions. There's a difference between wrong and insufficient. Garrett's expression softened slightly. I don't doubt your integrity, Sheriff, but I do question your thoroughness. He turned back to Sarah's cell. Miss Calloway, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there anyone in this town who might want to harm Mayor Whitmore? Anyone with a grudge against his family or his business interests? Sarah thought carefully. The mayor is a powerful man. I'm sure he's made enemies over the years, but I don't know specifics. I'm not privy to the business dealings of the wealthy families. But you hear things. You're a teacher. Parents talk around you. Sarah searched her memory, thinking back through years of casual conversations at school pickups and town gatherings. There was talk last spring about a land dispute. The Carmichael family wanted to buy a parcel near the creek, but the mayor refused to sell, said he had other plans for it. James Carmichael was angry enough to make threats, but that was months ago. Garrett nodded slowly. What kind of threats? The usual bluster, said Whitmore. Would regret it, that he'd pay for his stubbornness, but everyone assumed it was just talk. James has a temper, but he's all bark and no bite, and yet someone did make the mayor pay, Garrett said quietly. Someone burned down his warehouse and cost him thousands of dollars. The implication hung in the air. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. You think James Carmichael burned the warehouse? I think it's worth investigating. What else do you remember about that dispute? Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to recall details she hadn't thought about in months. The land in question had water rights attached to it. That's what James really wanted. His cattle operation needs more water access, especially during dry summer. Without it, he'd have to reduce his herd or pay for water from other sources. Water rights. Garrett's voice sharpened with interest. That's motive enough for almost anything out here. How much land was involved? I'm not sure exactly. Maybe 40 acres? But it was the location that mattered. Right along the creek where the water runs year-round. Garrett paced again, his mind clearly working through the implications. Sheriff, did you investigate James Carmichael after the fire? Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Carmichael is a respected member of the community. He wouldn't. That's not what I ask. Did you investigate him? No, sir. There was no reason to. The evidence pointed to Miss Calloway. The evidence that was conveniently placed to point to Miss Calloway. Garrett corrected. I want to speak with James Carmichael. Where can I find him? His ranch is about 8 miles north of town. But Mr. Garrett, I really don't think. Your thoughts on the matter are noted, Sheriff. I'll ride out there this afternoon. Garrett turned back to Sarah. Is there anything else? Any other conflicts or tensions in town that might be relevant? Sarah hesitated. There was something, a memory that had been nagging at the edges of her consciousness for days. There's one more thing. The week before the fire, I saw the mayor's son, Timothy, talking with someone behind the schoolhouse. It seemed odd because school had ended for the day, and he should have gone straight home. Who was he talking to? I couldn't see clearly. A man, I think, but he was standing in shadow. I only noticed because Timothy looked upset, almost frightened. I asked him about it later, but he said it was nothing. Garrett's expression grew thoughtful. Frightened, like he'd been caught doing something wrong, or like he was being threatened. Sarah considered the distinction. Threatened, I think. He had that look children get when they're scared of adults, when they know they're in over their heads, but don't know how to ask for help. And you didn't pursue it. I tried, but he clammed up completely, wouldn't say another word about it. I thought about mentioning it to his father, but Timothy begged me not to. He said it would only make things worse. Garrett was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was grim. Sheriff, I need you to bring Timothy Whitmore here. I want to speak with the boy. His father won't allow it. His father doesn't have a choice. Either the boy comes here voluntarily, or I'll have grounds to suspect the mayor himself of obstruction. Which would you prefer? The sheriff's face went white. Mr. Garrett, you can't be serious. Mayor Whitmore would never what? Never use his own son to frame an innocent woman. Never coach a child to lie. I don't know what the mayor would or wouldn't do, Sheriff. That's why I need to ask questions. 30 minutes later, Timothy Whitmore stood in the jail with his father beside him. The boy was 12 years old, small for his age, with his mother's delicate features and his father's calculating eyes. But those eyes held something else now. Fear. Mayor Whitmore's face was flushed with anger. This is outrageous, Garrett. My son has already given his statement. There's no reason to subject him to further questioning. There's every reason, Garrett said calmly, especially since his statement is the cornerstone of the case against Miss Calloway. I'm simply ensuring that justice is served. Justice has already been served. The woman is guilty. Garrett ignored him and knelt down to Timothy's eye level. His voice became gentle, almost paternal. Timothy, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here to find out the truth. Do you understand the difference? The boy nodded, his eyes darting to his father and then back to Garrett. Good. Now I want you to tell me exactly what you saw the evening before the fire. Take your time and don't worry about what anyone else wants you to say. Just tell me what you actually saw with your own eyes. Timothy swallowed hard. I saw Miss Calloway walking past the warehouse. She stopped and looked at it. How long did she stop for? I don't know. Maybe a minute. And what was she doing while she looked at it? Was she walking around it, examining it closely? No, sir. She was just standing there, staring. What direction was she facing? Timothy's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Was she looking at the front of the warehouse? The side? The back? Which direction? Oh. The side. I think. The side facing the church. Garrett glanced at Sheriff Brennan. The side facing away from the street? Yes, sir, the sheriff confirmed. Interesting. Garrett turned back to Timothy. And how far away from Miss Calloway were you when you saw this? The boy hesitated. I was across the street. Doing what? Another hesitation, longer this time. Just walking. Just walking, Garrett repeated. At what time of day? Near sunset. And where were you walking to? Timothy's face went pale. Home. From where? The mayor stepped forward. That's enough, Garrett. The boy has answered your questions. Not all of them. Garrett's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Timothy, where were you coming from when you saw Miss Calloway? I told you, I was just walking. The truth, son. Where were you coming from? Tears welled up in Timothy's eyes. I can't say. I promised I wouldn't tell. Promised who? The boy's face crumpled. I can't. He said he'd hurt my mother if I told. The jail fell silent. Even Mayor Whitmore seemed shocked into stillness. Garrett's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah saw the fury flash in his grey eyes. Who threatened your mother, Timothy? Garrett asked softly. I can't. Yes, you can, and you must, because right now, an innocent woman is going to hang for something she didn't do, and you're the only person who can stop it. Is that what you want? To let Miss Calloway die? Timothy looked at Sarah for the first time, really looked at her. She saw the moment his resolve broke, saw the weight of his secret become too heavy to bear. It was Mr. Carmichael, he whispered. James Carmichael. He was at the warehouse that night. I saw him with the oil can. He saw me watching, and he grabbed me and said if I told anyone, he'd make sure my mother had an accident. He said he knew where she went shopping, when she was alone. He said no one would ever know it wasn't an accident. Mayor Whitmore staggered backward, as if struck. Jesus Christ. He told me what to say, Timothy continued, the words pouring out now like water from a broken dam. He said to tell everyone I saw Miss Calloway at the warehouse, that she was acting strange. He said if I did that, my mother would be safe. So I did. I'm sorry, Miss Calloway. I'm so sorry. The boy was crying openly now, and Sarah felt her own tears on her cheeks. Garrett stood and placed a hand on Timothy's shoulder. You did the right thing telling the truth. That took courage. He looked at the sheriff. I want James Carmichael arrested immediately. Sheriff Brennan was already reaching for his gun belt. I'll gather a posse. If he threatened a child, if he's been terrorizing this family. Wait. Mayor Whitmore's voice cracked. He seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. We need to think about this carefully. Carmichael is dangerous. If we come at him directly, if he thinks Timothy talked, he might make good on his threats, which is exactly why we need to act now, Garrett said, before he has a chance to run or to hurt anyone else. The mayor's hands were shaking. My wife, someone needs to get Margaret to safety. If Carmichael finds out, I'll send 2 of my men to escort Mrs. Whitmore to my ranch, Garrett said. She'll be protected there, but we can't wait. Every minute we delay gives Carmichael more time to prepare or escape. Sheriff Brennan nodded grimly. I'll need at least 6 men. Carmichael won't come quietly. You'll have them. I brought 3 of my best ranch hands with me. They're waiting at the hotel, and I'm coming with you. Sarah watched this exchange from her cell, her emotions a tangled mess of relief, anger, and lingering fear. The truth was finally coming out, but Timothy's revelation had opened up new dangers. If Carmichael was desperate enough to threaten a child and frame an innocent woman, what else might he do when cornered? What about Miss Calloway? Timothy asked, his voice small. Can she go free now? The sheriff looked at Garrett, who looked at the mayor. A silent conversation passed between them. Layers of meaning Sarah could only partially interpret. The evidence needs to be properly evaluated, Mayor Whitmore said slowly. Due process must be followed. Due process. Sarah's voice cut through the room like a blade. You were ready to hang me without a trial, but now that the real criminal has been identified, suddenly you're concerned about due process. The mayor had the grace to look ashamed. Miss Calloway, save it. Sarah gripped the bars of her cell. I don't want your apologies. I want out of this cage. Now. Garrett turned to the sheriff. She's right. There's no legal justification for holding her any longer. The primary witness has recounted his testimony and provided evidence that implicates someone else. Release her. But the physical evidence was planted. Clearly, we all know it now. Garrett's voice brooked no argument. Unless you want me to ride to the territorial capital and explain to a federal judge why you continued to detain an innocent woman after the truth came out. Sheriff Brennan pulled out his keys with trembling hands. The lock clicked open, and Sarah stepped out of the cell for the first time in 17 days. Her legs were unsteady, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Garrett caught her elbow, steadying her. Easy, he said quietly. You've been through hell. Take your time. Sarah wanted to argue, to prove she was strong enough to walk out of here on her own power. But her body betrayed her, and she leaned against Garrett's solid presence for just a moment before straightening. Thank you, she said, meeting his eyes, for believing me when no one else would. I believe in evidence and logic, he replied, and the evidence never supported the charges against you. I just had to make everyone else see it. Mayor Whitmore stepped forward, his face haggard. Miss Calloway, I owe you an apology that words can't adequately express. I let my anger and my grief over the warehouse cloud my judgment. I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have protected my son instead of using him. You should have trusted me, Sarah interrupted. I taught your children. I lived in this town for nearly 30 years, and you were ready to hang me based on planted evidence and a coerced statement from a frightened child. The mayor's face went red, then white. You're right. You're absolutely right. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. You can start by tearing down those gallows, Sarah said coldly. Within the hour, the posse was assembled. Sheriff Brennan, Maxwell Garrett, and 6 armed men stood in the street, preparing to ride to the Carmichael ranch. Sarah watched from the doorway of the jail, still unsteady on her feet, but unwilling to retreat to safety while others rode out to face danger on her behalf. Garrett approached her before mounting his horse. You should rest. Go home, eat something, recover your strength. I will. After this is finished. He studied her face for a moment, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. You're stronger than you look. I've had to be, he nodded, understanding in that simple gesture. We'll bring him in. I give you my word. Be careful. Timothy said Carmichael is dangerous. Most desperate men are. Garrett swung up into his saddle with easy grace. But desperation makes people careless too. He's had weeks to think he got away with it. That confidence will work against him. The posse rode out, dust rising from their horses' hooves. Sarah watched until they disappeared from view, then made her way slowly toward her cottage. People stared as she passed, their faces showing a mixture of shame and curiosity. No one spoke to her. No one offered help or apology. They simply watched, as passive now as they'd been when she was imprisoned. Mrs. Henderson was sweeping her porch again. She paused as Sarah approached, the broom still in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have believed you." Sarah stopped. Of all the people in Redemption Creek, Mrs. Henderson had been the closest thing she'd had to a friend. The betrayal had cut deep. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "You should have." She walked on before Mrs. Henderson could respond. Her cottage looked exactly as she'd left it 17 days ago. The breakfast dishes still sat on the table, now covered in dust. The bed was unmade. Her teaching materials lay scattered across the desk by the window. It was like walking into a tomb, a preserved moment of her life before everything fell apart. Sarah sank into her father's old chair and let the tears come. They'd been building for weeks, held back by anger and defiance, and the sheer necessity of survival, but now, in the safety of her own home, she could finally release them. She cried for the injustice, for the loneliness, for the fear that had gripped her heart every time she looked at those gallows. She cried for the loss of her innocence about human nature, about the fragility of trust and community. When the tears finally stopped, she felt empty but also cleansed. She stood and began putting her house back in order, each small action helping to reclaim her life from the chaos that had consumed it. She was washing the dishes when she heard horses returning. Through the window she saw the posse riding back into town. But something was wrong. They were riding too fast, and several of the men were looking back over their shoulders as if expecting pursuit. Sarah dried her hands and stepped outside. The posse pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, and she could see immediately that James Carmichael was not with them. Garrett dismounted and strode toward her, his face grim. "He's gone." The ranch was abandoned. "Looks like he cleared out this morning. Took his best horses and whatever he could carry." Sarah's stomach dropped. "He ran. Someone must have warned him. The only people who knew we were coming were the ones in that jail." Garrett's eyes were hard. "Someone in this town is still protecting him." Sheriff Brennan approached, removing his hat. "We found evidence at his ranch, though. The same kind of blue fabric as what was planted at the scene, and oil cans, matches, everything he would have needed. He's guilty, no question about it. But he's free," Sarah said bitterly. "He threatened a child, destroyed property, framed me for murder, and now he's riding away what consequences?" Garrett's jaw tightened. "Not for long. I'm sending word to every town and ranch within 100 miles. He won't get far." "You don't know that," Sarah said. "He could disappear into the wilderness. Head to Canada or Mexico. We may never find him. Then we'll keep looking." Garrett's voice was firm. "Justice delayed is not justice denied. Not while I'm still breathing." The sheriff cleared his throat. "There's another problem. Word's spreading about what happened. People are asking questions, getting angry. Some folks are saying we should have known better than to trust Carmichael. Others are saying we moved too fast, should have kept Miss Calloway locked up until we were certain." "Until you were certain?" Sarah couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "You were ready to hang me tomorrow. How much more certain could you get?" Brennan had no answer to that. Garrett looked between them, his expression thoughtful. "The town needs to hear the truth. All of it. From Timothy, from Miss Calloway, from everyone involved. People need to understand what happened here." "A town meeting," the sheriff said slowly. "Tonight, at the church. We can lay out the evidence, explain the investigation." "No." Sarah's voice was sharp. "No meetings at the church. Reverend Hayes stood by while they built gallows for an innocent woman. He offered me damnation instead of comfort. We'll meet in the town square, where everyone can see and hear. Garrett nodded approvingly. The town square it is. 6 o'clock. Make sure everyone knows. The hours before the meeting passed in a blur. Sarah changed into a fresh dress, one of the few she owned, that wasn't stained with jail grime and despair. She brushed her hair until it shone, pinned it up the way her mother had taught her. If she was going to face the people who'd condemned her, she would do it with dignity. At 5:30, she walked to the town square. The gallows still stood there, a monument to how close she'd come to death. Someone had already begun dismantling it, pulling down the crossbeam, but the platform remained. Sarah climbed the steps and stood where she would have died, looking out at the growing crowd. People gathered slowly at first, then in larger groups, families, shopkeepers, ranch hands, everyone drawn by curiosity and guilt and the simple human need to understand what had happened in their midst. Sarah saw familiar faces, students' parents, people she'd known her entire life, and now she saw them clearly for what they were. Not monsters, not saints, just ordinary people who'd made terrible choices when tested. Mayor Whitmore arrived with his wife and son. Margaret Whitmore looked pale and shaken, her hand gripping Timothy's shoulder. The boy's eyes were red from crying, but he stood straight, his chin lifted in what might have been pride or might have been defiance. Reverend Hayes stood at the edge of the crowd, his thin face unreadable. Mrs. Henderson was there with her husband, the Morrison twins' parents, Emma Patterson's family. All of them waiting, watching, judging even now. At 6 o'clock precisely, Maxwell Garrett stepped up onto the platform beside Sarah. His presence seemed to steady the crowd, his authority acknowledged even by those who resented it. "People of Redemption Creek," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "We're here tonight because a grave injustice was nearly committed. An innocent woman was arrested, imprisoned, and condemned to hang based on false evidence and coerced testimony, and every single person in this town bears responsibility for what almost happened." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some heads dropped in shame, others lifted in protest. "I'm not here to assign blame," Garrett continued. "I'm here to ensure that you understand what happened, so it never happens again. Sheriff Brennan, if you would explain the investigation." The sheriff stepped forward, his face grim. He laid out the evidence, piece by piece, the oil can, the footprints, the fabric, and then he explained how each piece had been examined more carefully, how the inconsistencies had emerged, how the whole case had unraveled under scrutiny. Then Timothy Whitmore stepped forward. The crowd fell silent as the boy climbed the platform steps, his small frame dwarfed by the adults around him. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "I lied," he said. "Mr. Carmichael told me what to say, and I said it because I was scared. He threatened to hurt my mother. He said if I told the truth about seeing him at the warehouse with the oil can, he would make sure she had an accident. So I blamed Miss Calloway instead." The crowd erupted, voices raised in shock, anger, disbelief. Parents pulled their children close. Men shouted questions that no one could hear over the general uproar. Garrett held up his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided. "Timothy showed more courage today than most adults show in a lifetime," Garrett said. "He told the truth even though it was hard, even though it meant admitting he'd lied. That's the kind of integrity this town should value." Mayor Whitmore stepped up beside his son, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "My son did what he had to do to protect his mother. I don't fault him for that. But I fault myself for not seeing what was happening, for not questioning the evidence more carefully, for allowing my anger over the warehouse to blind me to the truth." He turned to face Sarah direct. "Miss Calloway, I wronged you in ways I can never fully make right. I let a man use my son as a weapon against you. I built gallows to hang an innocent woman. I turned my back on someone who deserved better from this community. All I can offer now is my apology and my commitment to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The apology was genuine. She could see that, but it didn't erase the 17 days she'd spent in a cell, the fear, the despair, the knowledge that her entire town had abandoned her. "Your apology is noted," she said quietly. "Whether I can accept it is something I'll have to decide over time." She stepped forward to the edge of the platform, looking out at the faces below. Some showed shame, others defiance, still others simple confusion. These were the people she'd lived among her entire life, and she realized now that she'd never really known them at all. "I want to tell you what it feels like," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "I want you to understand what you did to me. For 17 days I sat in a jail cell knowing I was innocent. I watched you build gallows for me. I heard my own voice grow hoarse from shouting the truth that none of you wanted to hear." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. "I taught your children," Sarah continued. "I helped them learn to read and write and think. I cared about their futures and their dreams. And when I needed you to believe in me, to give me the same benefit of doubt you'd give any neighbor, you turned away. You were ready to kill me rather than investigate. You chose convenience over justice." A woman in the crowd began to cry. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah saw. Others looked down at their feet, unable to meet her eyes. "James Carmichael is the one who burned that warehouse," Sarah said. "He's the one who planted evidence. He's the one who threatened a child. But he couldn't have done any of it without your help. Every person who looked away, who didn't ask questions, who accepted the easy answer, you all helped him nearly get away with murder." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if this town can be my home anymore after what's happened. But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that justice requires more than just following evidence. It requires courage. It requires standing up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. And it requires believing in each other, especially when belief is hardest." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to respond. 3 weeks after the town meeting, Sarah stood in her classroom watching the morning sun paint the floorboards gold. The children would arrive soon, their voices filling the space that had been silent for too long. The school board had asked her to return, had begged her really, and after much consideration, she'd agreed. Not for them, but for the children who deserved an education regardless of their parents' failures. The gallows were gone now, dismantled completely, and the lumber burned. Mayor Whitmore had overseen the destruction personally, as if erasing the physical evidence could somehow erase the shame. Sarah had watched from her cottage window, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of completion. Maxwell Garrett had stayed in Redemption Creek longer than he'd intended, organizing search parties for James Carmichael and ensuring that Sarah's name was fully cleared throughout the territory. Wanted posters had been distributed, rewards offered. Carmichael would be found eventually. Men like him always were, driven by desperation to make mistakes that would lead to their capture. But for now he remained free, a shadow on the edge of Sarah's consciousness. The door opened, and Garrett himself stepped in. He'd been spending more time in town lately, though his ranch still demanded most of his attention. Sarah had grown accustomed to his visits, to the quiet conversations they shared over coffee in her cottage. "The children will be here soon," she said without turning around. "I know, I wanted to speak with you before they arrived." He moved to stand beside her at the window. "I'm heading back to the ranch tomorrow. I've been away too long as it is." Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. His life was elsewhere, and whatever connection had formed between them during this crisis would fade with distance and time. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for believing me, for investigating when no one else would, for giving me back my life." "You gave yourself back your life," Garrett replied. "I just helped clear the obstacles." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the town wake up beyond the window. There's something I need to tell you, Garrett said finally, about why I came to Redemption Creek in the first place. Sarah turned to look at him, surprised. I assumed it was business with the mayor. That was part of it. But the real reason was you. He met her eyes steadily. I'd heard about the case about a school teacher being condemned without trial. It reminded me of something that happened years ago in another town. A woman falsely accused, no one willing to stand up for her. By the time I heard about it and rode there to help, it was too late. They'd already hanged her. Sarah's breath caught. Maxwell. Her name was Catherine. She was a widow, a seamstress, accused of poisoning a wealthy man who'd been courting her. The evidence was manufactured, the witnesses paid off, and the town rushed to judgment because it was easier than admitting one of their own might be a murderer. His voice was quiet, but filled with old pain. I swore I'd never let that happen again if I could prevent it. So when I heard about you, I rode here as fast as I could. You saved my life. I did what should have been done in the first place. What this whole town should have done. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. I want you to have this. It's not charity, it's compensation for the wages you lost, for the suffering you endured. Mayor Whitmore contributed as well. Sarah took the pouch, feeling the weight of coins inside. This is too much. It's not nearly enough, but it's a start. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I also want to extend an invitation. If you ever decide you can't stay in Redemption Creek, there's a place for you at my ranch. I employ teachers for the children of my workers. Or if teaching isn't what you want anymore, there are other opportunities. You'd be welcome. Sarah looked at him. This man, who'd ridden into her life like something from a storybook, and changed everything. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. He touched the brim of his hat. Take care of yourself, Sarah Calloway, and you, Maxwell Garrett. He left then, and Sarah was alone with her thoughts, and her classroom, and the sound of children's voices approaching from the street.